So my research, so my research is in Indigenous representation, specifically in AP textbooks. So the statement of the problem is how it's important to examine materials that are being used in our education systems. And then particularly, I wanted to pay attention to the AP textbooks, as we have the perception that they are at least critical because they are preparing students for university or higher education. Yet there hasn't been a lot of research dedicated to that. Although I do understand how textbook analysis are really extensive, I think it's important to like examine them because the AP textbooks are being used nationwide compared to what we call like regular history classes in high schools. They are basically employed by statewide publishers or like state or whoever the state chooses to be one of the main publishers in schools. So the book I chose was the AP textbook, The American Pageant, and specifically the American Pageant. So background, textbook analysis that I first got introduced to was Aldridge, and their study was basically on master narrative analysis through the lens in examining how Martin Luther King Jr. was portrayed. And they found out how there's 3 different types of portrayals that he fits into, but it still remains to the norm of the dominant narrative. And then Lansing and Billings also points out how many social study curriculum leaves the absence of minoritized groups. And sometimes if they are included, it's not from their perspective, it's often really minimal and not at all from their voice. And then both Calderon and Bigelow do kind of struggle and like disrupt in how we do education, specifically in curriculum, and finding out ways to better show and represent Indigenous community members. So my guiding question was, how are Indigenous students represented in the AP textbook? So methods, I leveraged the theory of master narrative, which the theory of master narratives, just to reiterate, it's how many like the curriculum textbooks or passages follow a narrative or chronological order. And then it refers to master in the sense that it's dominant adjacent, that the master narrative is in relations to the dominant group, in which case in US American history is the white male perspective that really does not leave room for the inclusion of other individuals. So in my methods, I first did a pass through to the textbook focused on identifying markers of Indigenous representation. This was used as just identifying any mentions throughout it, included text, photos, and other primary resources. And then my second pass through was just to like, again, re-imagine myself into the work and get out themes. And then my current research is working with the rubric to examine if these said chapters were critical or if there were moments of criticalness or not. So here I have adapted this rubric from Bigelow, from Rethinking Columbus, and I have 4 questions, which are some of the questions involved in the curriculum or in the rubric, but I hope to expand it just to make the research clear on which we would consider critical and which we would not. So one of the questions I have is, when Indigenous communities were mentioned, from one perspective was it done? I think this is important because although if I include Indigenous community, it might not be valuable or actually truthful. And then for the second question, sometimes moments of violence in which is described throughout wars or genocides, sometimes these points are not really made within a factual or moment that adds value to the history moment. And I think it's important to consider the last 2 questions in the context in if it's done to adhere to the master narrative or if it's done to disrupt the master narrative. So here I have a little example of the first 2 parts and chapters. So the book was divided into 40 chapters, and each part had 6 like parts, which were like introductions to segments of the textbook. And this was really conductive to how many textbooks follow a chronological order in explaining the history, just to adhere to this narrative or storytelling in history that often employs, which is effective, but we have to understand that there are constraints to that. So here I've included an example of a mention of Indigenous representation. I do want to mention that although this textbook was word heavy, it did lack pictures, but this is an example of a picture where we just see the reference to Indigenous populations or Native Americans in America, and just culminating the Trail of Tears, that it's a pretty large section in the history. And so that leads me into my initial results. So Indigenous populations and community members are either divided into one of these 5 themes, which do occur in a chronological order. First, they're either seen as greeters in the arrival of white Europeans. Then they transform into barriers in the United States, becoming a flourishing country. Then they are sufferers of the Trail of Tears and policies. And then towards the end of the chapter, they become associates towards the end of the textbook, they become associates during the New Deal. And then at the end of the text, they do mention how Indigenous populations are modern day individuals who are part of America. All of these themes overall at the moment seem to really confide to the master narrative and do not leave a lot of room to preference the Indigenous representation from a meaningful place. So here I've included a little chart that shows the number of mentions, and it just really does follow the themes from the previous slide, as we see how there are, in the first few sections, we talk about the early federalism, and that's really a lot of times, not because it's meaningful, but just because they have to do that in adherence to why they to establish their history. And then although I did talk about a lot of adherence to the master narrative, I think towards the end of the textbook, there is mention of a meaningful inclusion, specifically for one of the laws, and how there was discussion among the Native American communities and whether this law is actually meaningful or respectful. And it does show a light into the nuance of history and the pushback and dilemmas involved. And then I do have another quote that adheres to the master narrative, but it's basically covering the fact that how Native Americans are used in the sense that like how their image or their mentioning is used to justify the actions of white European settlers, and how inside the textbook we see that we're including them, but we're not actually including them. We're including them to make ourselves look better, which at the end is not at all conducive to the perspectives of that history. So for my conclusion, it is, although there are moments of representation, Indigenous people are not allowed to tell their own story. And although we may say that this is not everybody gets to tell their own story, Indigenous people are one of the most left out and erased parts of history, as in this textbook specifically, there were acts and genocide that was not at all mentioned. It was mentioned in the sense that they mentioned why it was done, but not the fact or their consequences, their perspectives. And then Indigenous individuals are mainly represented in the US history and segments. And specifically in this textbook, I saw 5 themes emerge, but they are not allowed a continuous presence in history. They are like figures or like side characters that are either during or present in one certain time of area, and then they're not. I think it is important to recognize the flaws in the curriculum that promote a master narrative, in this case to a dominant white perspective, and become active agents of change to better develop textbooks and curriculum to help educators. But then that does not say that would fix the problem. I think there are a lot of issues in the educational system that really do impact minoritized groups more than other students. Okay, so I would like to acknowledge and thank my faculty mentor, Dr. Rita Coley. And here are my references. Thank you.
Great, thank you.